Hello, my name is Katherine Kelaidis, and I'm the resident scholar at the National Hellenic Museum. And welcome to the National Hellenic Museum's digital event series. So, one of the things that we've been sort of exploring through our digital events and in book club, which I hope you sign up for, we're going to talk about a book club selection today, is the idea of classical antiquity today. So, the sort of academic term, the subdiscipline of classics, and we're going to talk about that word classics today as well, that belongs to is reception studies, the reception of classical antiquity. So today what I want to do is talk to you about this idea of classics, the ways in which the idea of the classical dominates a lot of our thought about Hellenism, about Greek identity. We're going to talk about where the classics come from and how the classics are used and misused or abused today. So today I want to talk to you about the reception of classical antiquity. I want to talk to you about what classical antiquity has meant to people after classical antiquity. So why is this important? Well, it's important because it's been important to people for a long time. So you might recognize on the screen here our September book club selection, Circe, by Madeline Miller. It's a retelling of the story of Circe from the perspective of the female protagonist, which of course is not something we commonly see in ancient literature, though we do have examples, to be clear. Madeline Miller has used classical themes before. She's the author of the best-selling Song of Achilles, which is, once again, this retelling of the story of the Iliad. It's modern reinterpretation of the Iliad. And when we talk about classical reception, in some ways, what we are talking about is the reinterpretation in time and place of a story that originates in ancient Greece or Rome. This isn't the only example. There's lots of examples. Margaret Atwood's Talcott, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Oedipal Cadet, Brechtal's Antigone, which is of course a reinterpretation of the Antigone set during the Nazi era. We see this in paintings and film. We see this in architecture, right? When societies want to convey their democracies, you see the US Capitol there. They use images from classical antiquity. Classical antiquity is all around us. And when we say the classics, we have a very good sense of the idea that we know what people are talking about. Which is why it might come as a surprise to you that this idea of the classics is actually a pretty recent one in terms of the classics themselves. I'm going to move myself down below there so that I don't block the printing. So, what are the classics and why does it matter? The American author William Faulkner, who's one of the great Southern, sort of that great Southern American literary tradition, which is itself very obsessed in some ways with the past, with what has come before, and as we'll see, that has some connection to the classics. Faulkner wrote that the past is not dead. It is not even past. And if there's one thing 2020 has taught us, and I think 2020 has taught us a lot of things, one of the things 2020 has taught us is that history is very much alive today. And this is completely true. This is this is probably most true in this idea of the classical. So when we say classics or the classical, we're referring to ancient Greece and Rome, and we're actually referring to a huge period of time and a huge tract of land. When you call something classical or referred to ancient antiquity, you're really referring to a period of time that stretched, you could be referring to a period of time that stretched from about 800 BCE to about 500 CE. Some people say even later. Some people would, not separate off the Byzantines. And then we're talking about going into the 15th century. But even in these sort of conservative limits, we're talking about a period of roughly, over 1,000 years, 1,300 years, 1,300 to 1,400 years. We're also talking about a span of geographic space that's huge, right? So the Roman Empire, for example, expanded as far west as the British Isles. And the kingdoms of Alexander the Great reached as far east as India and modern Afghanistan. And there were Greco-Roman kingdoms. There were Greco-Indo-Grecian kingdoms, Indo-Hellenistic kingdoms that survived in Nepal and northern India for centuries, right? So you're talking about a huge tract of time, and you're also talking about a huge tract of land. And so obviously, in reality, there's a huge amount of diversity in this distance, right? There's not this unified sort of classical world. That it just doesn't exist. It couldn't exist because any amount of time that long and any amount of space that big is going to have variation. There's not going to be unity. And it's uncertain that the people, it's certain that the people living in that time would have thought of themselves as a sort of unified historical or cultural group. Certainly the kingdoms, though they would have understood they had cultural affinities, it's unlikely they would have sort of seen themselves as unified in some way. And when we see, for example, in the late Roman Republican and early imperial period, ways in which the Romans are negotiating their own identity with respect to the Greek identity. So where does this idea of the classical come from? The idea of the classical is actually relatively late, and it emerges during the Renaissance. It emerges in the 15th and 16th centuries in Western Europe after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and this is important. One of the things that brings ancient Greek learning in particular, back to Western Europe, of course, we talk a lot about the Arab influence in that. One of the principal motivators of the Renaissance is the recovery of ancient Greek learning through refugee Byzantine scholars. So following the fall of Constantinople, large numbers of Byzantine elites in particular flee what was once the Byzantine Empire, and they find themselves, predominantly in Italy, but also in France. That's a topic I'm writing about right now, actually. So stay tuned for that. I might give you guys a sneak peek into that. But they flee, they bring with them, Greek for one thing. So through large chunks of the Middle Ages, most people, large chunks of people, even educated people in Western Europe couldn't read Greek, so they bring Greek with them, they bring classical antiquity. And it's really in the Renaissance, following the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, that this idea of the classical begins to take shape. However, it's not really until the Enlightenment, so we're talking now the 18th century, essentially, that the idea of the classics as this rarefied and unique moment, and also of the classics as the starting point of Western, and I put that in scare quotes, civilization begins to take place. So the idea that ancient Greece is somehow the origin point of this idea of the West, which is an Enlightenment idea as well, really starts to take shape in the 18th century. And it only takes shape as Western Europeans, the French, the English, the Portuguese, the Spanish, find themselves through their sort of exploration and colonization coming in contact with people from cultural traditions in other parts of the world, and in an attempt to assert sort of a Western superiority, they look to the classical past, and they create kind of an artificial classical past. They also create an educational curriculum out of this. So classical education as we know it today arrives in the Enlightenment. This idea of Greek and Latin and the study of Greek and Latin texts is the foundation of education, is something that arrives in the Enlightenment. And that classical education becomes an important gatekeeper. It is the symbol of elite status for 250 years, really from the early part of certainly by the 18th century, but from the mid-17th century down until the middle of the 20th century, really, when Oxford and Harvard removed the requirements for Greek and Latin for entry, it is this classical education, this idea of Greek and Latin learning being at the center of an elite education, that acts as a gatekeeper into sort of high society, into acceptable intellectual discourse. And it's something that different people at different times in different places avail themselves to. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to bring some people actually on this channel to discuss that real complexity. So while the classics, the idea of the classics is an artifice made up, sorry, had to swallow. Well, the idea of the classics is an artifice made up at a much later historical period than the actual ancient world. That artifice has had real deep consequences for people. One of those consequences, by the way, is Western support for the Greek Revolution. So the Philhellenes who supported the Greek Revolution in the early 19th century, those are people who had been nurtured on this idea of the classical, and had been nurtured on this 18th century idea, this idea that had arisen in the previous century, that the Greeks were the founders of Western civilization. And their idea of Greeks, their idea of Greekness, was founded in this ancient, predominantly Athenian past. And many of them, including, for example, Lord Byron, had a big surprise when they actually got to Greece and discovered that modern Greeks, you know, the people they were encountering, were much more shaped by their Byzantine Christian heritage, not by their ancient pagan heritage. So this idea is powerful. This idea has moved, this idea has created nations. The United States of America is a child of the Enlightenment, and in many ways a child of the classical education that many of the nation's founders had. The French Revolution, same thing, right? So the classics is an artifice, but that doesn't mean it's not real. Just because something, this is a common misconception, that because something is sort of a construction, it's not real. Here's what I tell my students all the time: the speed limit is a social construct, but it is very real, right? I know this because I paid many speeding tickets. So the classic, that's why we care about what the classics are, and that's why we still study the classics. But as you can imagine, something like this that has sort of acted as a gatekeeper for centuries and still kind of has this whiff of elitism to it, that is going to have its discontents. It's going to have people who have rejected it, right? So classics has historically occupied this place of privilege and has been used to perpetuate privilege of various kinds, economic and racial and all sorts. And this has put a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths about the classics. Even that word, right? Like, we don't call, you know, there's really good French literature too. We don't call it the classics. There's really good American literature. We don't have a special rarefied department for it. We teach American literature in English departments and sort of language departments. And some people have argued that we should do the same with the classics. And so all over the country, all over the world, in some universities, for example, classics departments have been disbanded and replaced with departments of Mediterranean studies, which frequently include modern Greek, but not modern Italian, which tends to be grouped with Romance studies. This is a whole thing. But this idea of sort of undoing the privilege of the classics has been very popular in a lot of academic circles, particularly over the past 25 to 30 years. But I would argue this is a bad idea. I actually my degrees are in classics. I have studied solely in classics departments. I actually don't like that idea. I don't think it's helpful because I don't think we can erase the past, and I don't think, and that's not about other issues, I just think undoing the idea of discipline of classics actually doesn't sort of start to untangle what that discipline has meant. I offer another way forward. Okay. Instead, I think what we've been doing has value, right? And we've been doing it subconsciously. We've been doing it without thinking about it. For as long as classics has occupied this rarefied and privileged position in society, there have been people who have used their access to it to question that elitism, to question that, to question those power dynamics, and to question the ideas of the classical. And in this questioning, classics is actually made more alive. So I have two images on the screen One is from a production of Antiquity that took place very recently that sort of revolves around the Black Lives Matter movement, and uses the story of Antigone to interrogate these questions. The Antigone story is the most produced theatrical piece in the world, and I think that's because it's so resonant, right? So I've seen Antigone's, for example, there's this example here, but I've seen Antigone's produced in Colombia to talk about rebels killed by Colombian forces. There's been an Antigone in Argentina around the disappeared. There were multiple Antigones during the Second World War, because the question of Antigone is really so salient, right? There's so many questions around Antigone about the state and the individual, about mourning, about what it means to mourn, and those sort of questions. Medea is also heavily produced around female violence, about killer mothers, right? Like these really complicated questions. This material does have value, and one of the reasons we know it has value is because it has impacted people and inspired people and comforted people and challenged people over centuries. And so I don't think dismantling that works. And also the band on my right, I think it'd be your right as well. That band is Antigone Rising. It's a post-punk band. It's a political feminist band. It takes the name Antigone for the reasons we just discussed. So I think there are ways to work through this. And if you're interested in that, some of our book club selections are along those lines. So I mentioned Madeline Miller. We did a book club. Our first book was a post-colonial, was a Caribbean writer writing the story of Odysseus. And we have Madeline Miller's book coming up. We have other examples of that. We're working on putting together more materials for you around that question. But I wanted to create this video to sort of explain the sort of terms of the debate so that you can join in the debate with us. Thank you so much. We appreciate your support here at the National Hellenic Museum. If you're interested in donating, we know that's a big ask in these difficult times, but we appreciate your support. The link is in the bio, like a real YouTuber now. Thank you so much. Have a lovely, lovely day, and we'll see you back here.